Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive, frankly fascinating historical puzzle, Latin America right after its wars of independence. You know, textbooks often treat independence like it's a finish line. The flags go up, the European rulers pack their bags, and boom, everybody lives happily ever after in a fair, completely equal society, right? Well, not exactly. Today we're going to break down why political freedom didn't instantly create social equality, and why the reality on the ground was actually much more complicated and a whole lot more interesting.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Our central mystery is right here. Why was the liberal dream of a brand new, equal society so incredibly difficult to achieve? I mean, they successfully threw off the Spanish and Portuguese crowns, but the true social revolution that everyone was expecting, it simply didn't happen right away. So what went wrong? To really understand this sharp contrast between the dream and the reality, we have to look at the specific factors and structures that survived the wars.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the liberal dream itself, and then we're going to systematically break down the specific roadblocks: economic ruin, the rise of caudillos, the Catholic Church, and the deep-rooted colonial casta system. Finally, we'll wrap up with the reality of a delayed revolution.
All right, part one, the liberal dream. What were these new nations actually trying to build?
So, back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, expectations were literally sky high. The air was just buzzing with Enlightenment ideas. People were watching the revolutions in the US and France, and they were massively inspired. They realized, hey, ordinary people actually can challenge these powerful monarchies. The leaders of the Latin American independence movements absolutely wanted to end Spanish and Portuguese control, for sure. But they also wanted to build new nations founded on liberty, equality, democracy, and natural rights. That was the big dream.
And, they actually pulled off that first step. They successfully fought off the European monarchies. But that beautiful dream of an equal society, it hit a brick wall. They achieved political independence, but they struggled terribly to build stable democracies. Instead of a smooth transition to equality, they were instantly met with immense political instability and old social systems that just completely refused to die.
Which brings us to part two, post-war economic ruin. Because let's face it, you can't build a utopia if you can't pay for it.
Let's look at how this builds, because economic instability acted like a devastating chain reaction. Step 1. The wars totally ravaged farms, mines, and cities. Step 2. To fund those wars, the new nations fell incredibly deep into debt. And here's the kicker. Because the colonial economies were originally designed solely to benefit European powers, these new countries didn't have diverse industries. They were entirely dependent on exporting raw materials. We're talking sugar, silver, coffee. The human cost of this setup was huge. The profits from those raw exports didn't trickle down at all. The wealth remained tightly concentrated with a few elite landowners, while the vast majority of ordinary people stayed completely impoverished.
So the big takeaway here is that stable democratic governments simply cannot thrive on top of a ruined, unequal economic foundation. Economic instability wasn't just a money problem. It was a massive roadblock to the entire social revolution.
Moving on to part 3, the rise of caudillos. When a new government is economically weak, a massive power vacuum opens up.
So, what is a caudillo? Basically, they were powerful military leaders who built up massive influence in private armies during the wars. Because the shiny new democratic governments were weak and drowning in debt, everyday people felt pretty unsafe. So naturally, they turned to these strong men for protection and just some basic order.
And while some of these caudillos genuinely promised reform, the reality is that a lot of them operated exactly like dictators. They sidelined the democratic systems entirely. Power became all about who had the biggest army and the fiercest personal loyalty, rather than, what was actually written in the new constitutions or decided at the ballot box. This heavy reliance on military force effectively crushed the liberal dream of a stable, representative republic.
Part 4. The Catholic Church. This was an institution holding massive power left over from the colonial era. Right after independence, society practically split right down the middle over what to do with the church. On one side, you had liberal reformers. They believed that to achieve true equality and modernization, they absolutely had to reduce the church's influence over the state and the economy. But on the other side, conservative leaders, who were backed by a very loyal public, strongly defended the church's traditional role. They wanted to preserve the institutions that had held their society together for centuries.
And this brilliantly illustrates the gridlock of the era because neither side could completely win out. This constant, bitter conflict between liberals wanting reform and conservatives wanting tradition created a massive rift. The ongoing battle over the role of the Catholic Church fueled even more political instability, making it almost impossible for these new nations to just unite and move forward.
All right, Part 5, the colonial caste system. This was perhaps the greatest, most stubborn barrier to equality of them all.
To truly understand why a true social revolution failed to happen immediately, we have to look at the deep-rooted casta system. This was a societal structure organized strictly by race and social class. In this system, your status, your rights, and your economic opportunities were literally determined the exact moment you were born.
Think of it like a rigid pyramid. During colonial times, the Peninsulares, people born in Spain, held all the top jobs. Right beneath them were the Criollos, who were of Spanish descent but born in the Americas. And down at the bottom were the mestizos, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans who faced severe discrimination and poverty. Now, when independence happened, the Peninsulares were kicked out, but the pyramid didn't collapse. Actually, the Criollo elite simply moved up into the top spot. They kept the exact same unequal system intact because, well, it perfectly protected their new wealth and political power.
And here is the really harsh truth of the era. For the indigenous populations, the enslaved Africans, and the mixed-race communities, political independence essentially meant meeting the new boss, who was exactly the same as the old boss. The colonial structures survived because they benefited the new ruling class, ensuring that social equality remained nothing but an illusion for the vast majority of people. Finally, Part 6, a delayed social revolution. Let's pull all these threads together.
So, when we look back and ask why that liberal dream of a new equal society was so incredibly difficult to achieve right after independence, we can point directly to these specific factors. The devastating economic instability that kept wealth at the top, the rise of caudillos who traded democracy for military force, the paralyzing political divisions over the role of the Catholic Church, and above all, that deep-rooted caste system that preserved the colonial racial hierarchy. All of these factors combined to prevent a true social revolution from occurring immediately. I want to leave you with this really powerful summary from our source material. Quote, "The revolutions changed who ruled Latin America, but true social revolution and equality would take much longer to achieve. They won the war for their borders, absolutely, but the war for their society? That had barely just begun. The colonial structures were simply too profitable and too deeply entrenched to be erased by a single declaration of independence." Which leaves us with a massive question to ponder. If these systems, the economic inequality, the reliance on strongmen, the intense racial hierarchies, were so firmly planted in the foundations of these nations back in the 1800s, how do the shadows of these deep-rooted colonial systems still affect society today? Because history isn't just in the past, right? It's the blueprint for the present. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this complex history in today's Explainer. Keep asking questions and keep investigating.